Intelligence authorities here in South Korea say they have credible information concerning North Korean casualties on the battlefield amid Russia's offensive against Ukraine, which in recent times has seen the exchange of strategic weapons. With more press perspective today. Hope your work week is off to a good start. It's November 25th here in South Korea and you're watching Press Perspective. Today we touch upon tensions over North Korea's growing military cooperation with Russia and its presence on the battlefield against Ukraine. For more on this, I have Dasl Yoon, a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, here in the studio. Dasl, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
I also have Steven Borowiec, a staff writer for Nikkei Asia. Steven, it's always great to have you here.
Always great to be here.
Right, Dasl, we'll start with your coverage. You recently wrote an interesting piece about a mystery North Korean general dispatched by Kim Jong-un to the battlefield against Ukraine. Who is this man and what is the implication of his presence on the war front?
So this mystery man, his name is Kim Jong-un, and he used to head the special forces inside North Korea. And it hasn't been that long since we learned that he assumed a broader role as the deputy chief of general staff in the North Korean army. And so he's generally kept a very low public profile in North Korea. We can sort of assume because North Korea wouldn't want much known about their special forces. But it was this year that he suddenly began appearing quite frequently next to leader Kim Jong-un. And him being dispatched to Russia along with the around 10,000, 11,000 North Korean troops now in Russia shows how invested North Korea is and how much importance this troop deployment carries to them, and that they want one of their top military officials really helping integrate North Korean forces with the Russian forces, and also to learn from the battlefield experience that they're getting there.
Right. Dasl, the Wall Street Journal also last week reported that a senior North Korean officer had been hurt following a Ukrainian assault. Are we speaking about the same general that you covered?
So the general who was wounded is yet to be named, but what we do know is that this general was quite close to the front lines, and that also comes to show how close North Korean troops in general are to the front lines, and how this comes to show that the U.S. and Western forces, they are sending a message that North Korean troops involved in Russia's fight against Ukraine, they will be targets as well.
Right. Steven, also on the battlefield last week, after denying Ukraine's allegation of an intercontinental ballistic missile launch, Russia's Vladimir Putin claimed that he tested a new intermediate-range ballistic missile, or a hypersonic missile, at Ukraine. First, for the sake of lay people like me, what is the difference between ICBM and an IRBM, or a hypersonic missile?
I think you can learn a lot of them by their names. I mean, a hypersonic missile goes very fast, and it's usually sent over a shorter distance. And I think the key with them is that they can move in the air, and they can change directions, and that makes them harder to detect on radar. An intercontinental ballistic missile is again, it's in the name. It's also goes very fast, but it's usually launched at a kind of vaunted trajectory, and it's meant to travel over a very long distance, and it's often meant to deliver a kind of payload, like maybe a nuclear warhead. So I think the reason that we hear about ICBMs with North Korea a lot is because it plays into their goal of ultimately being able to strike either the continental United States or any other target.
Right. Steven, some analysts have drawn quite a bit of attention on Mr. Putin's use of a sophisticated weapon, the hypersonic missile, to hit a target in eastern Ukraine that could have been, and according to them, been struck with a less sophisticated weapon. What do you suppose is his intention of testing this new hypersonic missile?
Well, the short answer is that I don't know exactly what they're thinking, but I can speculate, and I could just say that it probably plays into the longstanding Russian desire to convince the West that it is not in their interest to support Ukraine, that this is a conflict that is dangerous and would be wasteful, and it's something that they're better off staying out of. And the longer term view of that is that Russia's leadership is hoping that eventually the larger and more powerful country can just kind of wear down Ukrainian troops, and through kind of gradual attrition will, come to occupy Ukraine, if not formally, then at least on a kind of de facto basis, and show Ukraine and show other countries on Russia's perimeter that, ultimately Russia can step in and control them if it wants to. I think the kind of bigger message that this sends is perhaps not an intentional one. What it shows is that there's a real threat of escalation here, because in that, compared to, a year ago or even just like several months ago, the two sides seem to be kind of more openly teasing at, more dangerous and more destructive scenarios. And as anyone who studies history knows that this is how big conflagrations start. There's an escalation and then another escalation, and then someone maybe overreacts or misinterprets something, and then you end up with a bigger battle than anybody really bargained for. So as to what message Putin is trying to send, that's an open question. But I think to any observer of this war, what Biden has done in terms of allowing U.S. missiles to be used to strike Russian targets, and this hypersonic missile launch that you alluded to, it's a clear escalation. So looking back at that, I'm a little bit unnerved, and I do wonder more about the future of this conflict than I did before this all happened.
Right. Dasl, as Steven just mentioned, the test launch of a hypersonic missile by Russia took place after the U.S. approved the use of American-supplied longer-range missiles into Russian territory by Ukraine. There's been a lot of talk about why President Biden decided to grant that approval. How has the White House explained it, and what are pundits saying?
So U.S. officials have said that President Biden's decision to allow these long-range strikes is in part due to North Korea's troop deployment. So it is, in a sense, a response. It's part of their response. And I think this signifies how much Washington sees North Korea's troop involvement as an escalation in the Ukraine war. And even though Putin has explicitly said that he sees the approval of these long-range missiles as a red line, the Biden administration has, still gone through with it because they see it as almost an equal threat, I think.
Right. And Steven, how does the Biden administration's latest move look to affect the incoming Trump administration's policy on the war in Ukraine?
That's a very interesting question. I think the kind of implication of that question is like an assumption of continuity, that with the change of administrations, that things, at least to some extent, will continue along the same basis. I think with Trump coming in, you have to kind of question that, because I wonder if the leadership in Russia is going to look at a Trump administration, is going to in any way hold them responsible for things that took place before they got into power, or will they see that as a kind of clean slate moment? Trump has been pretty open about, I can't remember the exact wording of his statement, but something about let Russia do whatever they want to our allies, or attack them if they want. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable speculating as to how this might affect the Trump administration's incoming Ukraine policy. I mean, there are rumblings that Trump is going to attempt to initiate some kind of negotiation. Critics of this war have long said that, neither side can come to a decisive victory on the battlefield, so there has to be some kind of negotiated settlement. But with the two sides having non-overlapping positions on what this conflict, what it means and how it can be resolved, I don't see that as feasible. I am really interested to see what Trump says when he is not just a candidate anymore, but when he is actually in office, and when he is answering not just to the American public, but to the very large and very influential American arms industry, which has some kind of interest in this continuing. So as with many questions, I've got my popcorn. And
right. Steven, I know you hate to speculate, but I have to ask you this question. There are some pundits who claim that Trump might seek for a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia by allowing Russia to keep the territory that it has taken from Ukraine. What message do you suppose does that kind of peace deal give to the rest of the world?
Well, it's not a peace deal. I mean, it's not a peace deal because it's been achieved through aggression. So, but also let me just say, I don't hate speculating. I just feel somewhat uncomfortable doing it. I actually find it fun. But I mean, there's that James Baldwin line of you know, I cannot respect your opinion if it's based on my destruction. You cannot negotiate with somebody who's bent on your destruction. I don't see how anybody can convince the Ukrainian side to say, well, you're going to negotiate now with this aggressor who's come into your country and forcibly carved out bits of it and has kidnapped children and has bombed hospitals and has done. This is not a negotiating partner who acts in good faith. So I think it's a really flawed premise. I don't see any other like short-term objective for this war other than it kind of continuing to grind on, and in some ways with the possibilities of escalation that we outlined earlier, that's maybe even like kind of an optimistic scenario because that's better than the alternative of a drastic escalation. So everybody who's, you know, on the decision-making side of this has real interesting and real important decisions to make. And meanwhile, we're heading into another winter. It's about to get very cold in Ukraine again, and it's about to get, you know, there's about to be a bunkering down, and things could get even worse for the people who are living through this war on the ground. Let's not forget that. There are millions of people whose lives are tied up in this, and for whom this is not a policy or an academic discussion. I would just flag that.
For sure, Stephen, for sure. Beyond the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, Dasl, ever since the re-election of Mr. Trump, I have been asking quite a number of media members as well as pundits about the prospects of potential dialogue between Mr. Trump and Kim Jong-un after Mr. Trump enters office next year. Well, last week, Kim Jong-un actually shot down hopes of any such interaction. What exactly did Kim Jong-un say, and what do you suppose are the intentions of his hardline rhetoric with regard to dialogue with Mr. Trump?
So Kim Jong-un appeared at a defense expo in Pyongyang last week, and he gave a speech, and he basically said, I've explored all avenues in negotiations with the U.S., and it's not going to work out. He was saying that the U.S. policy of aggression and hostility, which he often refers to, has been unchanging. I think there are a variety of ways we could, sort of translate this message, but many analysts say that Kim Jong-un is not going to be easy to pull back into talks. It's not going to be easy to get him back to the negotiating table because he has, in the past few years, he's not only grown his nuclear and missile program, he's also cooperated so much with Russia on military and economic parts that he has more to gain from Russia, frankly, than he does from the U.S. And that makes it all the more difficult for the U.S. to try and negotiate a deal with North Korea, even if President-elect Trump takes office. And so I think because Russia has more to offer in from Kim Jong-un's perspective right now, he is sending the message that, in the short term, there's nothing that could pull me back into this. But at the same time, I don't think we should assume that he is completely shutting down talks, just when you look at the wording of what he was saying in this speech, he continuously refers to this aggressive policy, this hostile policy of the U.S. And I think some analysts actually translate that as a change in stance from the U.S. Could bring about a change in stance from North Korea. What Kim Jong-un doesn't want is to lose face the way he did in Hanoi in 2019, and that's what he's trying to avoid.
And Dasl, I wonder, do you suppose the incoming Trump administration, Donald Trump, he has said on the campaign trail that he thinks Kim Jong-un misses him. That being said then, do you see Mr. Trump as reaching out to Kim Jong-un once he enters office? Is that a likely scenario?
I think that's a very likely scenario. I think even before he was elected, he made it very clear that he wants to meet Kim Jong-un. He has had a good relationship with Kim Jong-un, and that he's the man to negotiate with Kim. So I think it's quite likely that there will be outreach, but I don't think I'm not sure how much of a response he's going to actually get from Kim in return.
Right. Meanwhile, Stephen, South Korea, for its part, it's been using multilateral platforms like the APEC and G20 to rally global support against North Korea's military cooperation with Russia. How would you assess the Yoon administration's current efforts?
I would ask, I think I have more questions than I do answers there. I think I would ask them, what form do you want this support to take? It seems to me that at this stage, it's mostly a communications exercise. It's mostly an attempt to draw attention to this growing partnership and to highlight just how potentially dangerous it is. But beyond that, I would like to ask the Yoon administration, so, once you have convinced whatever, either multilateral or bilateral partner that this relationship, that this collaboration is dangerous, where do you go from there? What are you going, does South Korea finally decide that it's going to supply lethal aid to Ukraine? Does Yoon attempt to convince the Biden administration to, take their military support that much further? Do they attack the real golden bear of somehow trying to convince European allies to increase their defense spending? So those are all big and really thorny questions, and they're probably not questions that a kind of middle power like South Korea really wants to attack head on. Yoon probably doesn't feel as though his administration has the kind of proper leverage or the proper kind of international standing to be really decisive on that front. So it seems to me like it's at this point, kind of on the communication side, and it's kind of just trying to create awareness and have the right people, the most influential kind of people, be clear on the growing danger of this relationship. But I think it begs the question of, so then what? What kind of practical measures, if any, do you take from there? And that's still something that remains a question. It's not and I don't think it has a clear answer right now.
Right. Dasl, Russia has revised its nuclear doctrine, allowing it to use its atomic arsenal in the event of a conventional attack if it is supported by a nuclear power. What are pundits saying about the prospects of an actual nuclear confrontation going forward?
I think this itself was actually quite an anticipated move. Russia has been talking about this for some time, but this, I think it would be an overstatement for us to say this is going to start a nuclear war. I think in part it is a response to the West supplying and approving the use of long-range weapons in Ukraine. And increasingly, countries like North Korea and Russia have been pointing to nuclear weapons as, their form of self-defense. And so overall, it raises the risk of nuclear proliferation, and the fact that even countries surrounding these nations like Russia and North Korea may be thinking about, such as South Korea, may be thinking about developing their own nuclear weapons. So I think this is more a concern in terms of sort of the global, proliferation of nuclear weapons, rather than Russia kind of immediately raising the stakes of a nuclear war all of a sudden, coming into action.
Right. Stephen, according to BBC News, satellite images show Russia supplying North Korea with crucial oil in blatant violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Now, this in turn has raised quite a lot of question about the actual effectiveness of the security framework. India, for its part, I believe, has urged for urgent reform of the UNSC. Do you support calls for reform of the United Nations Security Council?
I'm going to keep my objective reporter's hat, and I'm not going to say whether or not I don't think it's really for me to say whether or not I support that or not. I would instead say that anybody who's like monitoring this particular case and feels as though it's raising questions has not been paying attention for very long, because these are really old questions. Russia and China and other countries have been not perfectly cooperating with UN Security Council sanctions for a really long time. And to me, this doesn't really raise questions. It just highlights an old and very hard to solve problem. It's that what's at the whole of this kind of international sanction is the fact that these are sovereign countries and they can do what they want. And there's not nor should there be really a firm international mechanism for the UN to force any country to do something if they decide that it's not in their interest to do. It's unfortunate that North Korea and Russia can get away with the kinds of things that they can, but it's just the kind of fact of the world that we live in, that we have to choose between force and persuasion. We cannot force North Korea to give up nuclear weapons if they don't want to. We cannot force Russia to not give oil to North Korea if they decide that they want to. All we can do is attempt to persuade them. And that's I don't want to sound naive because it's, of course, very difficult to persuade these totalitarian countries to not act in the way that they've chosen to act. But we have force and we have communication. It's international relations 101. And as someone who lives in this part of the world, I hope we stay on the persuasion side and don't resort to force.
Right, of course. And I'd like to extend the same question to you, Dasl, actually. What are your thoughts with regard to calls for reform at the United Nations Security Council?
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's been a while since there's been talk about how non-effective sometimes the Security Council can be, especially when it comes to the North Korea question, right? Of imposing sanctions, enacting those sanctions. But like Steven mentioned, I don't think this is an issue that can be solved just by saying let's change the system of the UN Security Council. Let's reform it, and that will suddenly change the minds of countries involved. Because this is a global framework that has been around for a while, and I think it's going to be a process in terms of finding a solution that all these countries can agree on.
Right. Hopefully we'll come up with a solution in the near future then. And before we end though, Steven, I'd like to ask you just one more question. Earlier on, you talked about the possibility of perhaps South Korea supplying Ukraine with arms, given the presence of North Korean soldiers in the war front against Ukraine. Russia, for its part, this past weekend, called on South Korea not to arm Ukraine, claiming that it will respond in every way possible. What measures do you suppose Russia would seek to implement in the case of South Korea providing Ukraine with weapons?
I think first, probably it would be felt economically. There are some South Korean companies that have big operations in Russia, and I think Russia's probably looked at the precedent of China and THAAD in 2018, and they've seen how it's possible to, if you really want to, kind of freeze major South Korean companies and major South Korean industries' activities in your country. Russia is obviously a much less important economy than China is, but I think probably that's where they would start. I'd like to think that they wouldn't, attempt to engage in a conventional war with South Korea, but both sides do have a lot to lose, as if you read the left-wing Korean press, they're constantly reminding the Yoon administration that they should be thinking more about interests and less about values. They should be saying that, even though you might consider Ukraine to be a like-minded country, South Korea is still a country with a kind of struggling economy and an export-based economy at that, and it's vulnerable in many ways, and that what they really should be doing is seeking to kind of stay on everybody's good side to the extent that they can. So. Right. We'll see which direction they go in. Well,
we will. The Yoon administration, for its part, at the moment, as we speak, they're still contemplating their options. All right, Steven, as always, thank you so much for your insights today. And Dasl, thank you very much for your thoughts. Right, well, that ends Monday's edition of Press Perspective. We have more on the confrontations in Ukraine and in the Middle East in our session on Wednesday.